where was I? Oh yeah, her mother. So what was I couldn't decide if it was really interesting or actually kind of sad. In 22 years, Margaret Sanger's mom went through 18 pregnancies. 18 pregnancies with 11 live births. 7 miscarriages. So, I mean, it was, yes, really interesting, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know if I could be Margaret Sanger with 10 siblings. I don't know if I could do that. Like, that just sounds like a lot. So, Sanger released 2 columns in 1911 and 1912. They're called What Every Mother Should Know and What Every Girl Should Know, about sex, birth control, pregnancy, abortion, and everything like that. So her birth control, okay, I don't know about her birth control, so I don't know what she used back then. But her passion about birth control was simply just spreading the word on it, getting the information where it needed to go, and giving women the right to choose whether or not to have a child. So Margaret Sanger was arrested twice in New York City for this, outside of her clinic, which actually evolved. Her clinic was, and the conference was called the American Birth Control League. This actually evolved into what we know today as Planned Parenthood, which I thought was really interesting. She started this in 1916, and we're still talking about it today in 2016. It's over 100, that's 100 years later, literally 100 years. So sex has always been a forbidden topic in polite conversation until just recently. Until, we all just started becoming more open about it and, not scared to share information. But when Margaret Sanger was in New York, it was actually illegal. She was thrown in jail and put in a workhouse for 30 days just for trying to get information out that nobody wanted to hear. And before that, it was just not common in polite society to talk about it. So before and on November 18th, 1921 is actually the day that Margaret Sanger gave her speech on the morality of birth control. But before then, in the Industrial Revolution, what was common birth control was actually condoms for men made out of animal intestines. In 1839, that's when they vulcanized the rubber condom. IUDs, douching syringes, vaginal sponges, diaphragms, cervical caps, those all followed that in 1839. And don't worry, that's everything I'm going to say about those. I'm not going to tell y'all how it works or anything like that. So y'all can just... In 1873, the Comstock Act was passed. Now this act illegalized the production, the advertisement, and the giving of information on birth control and contraceptives. So under this act is what Margaret Sanger was arrested for. Just to let y'all know. So with this act being passed, they started doing false advertising for birth control with companies who actually made them. They called them hygiene products. They didn't call them women's birth control or contraceptives or anything like that. And one thing I found really cool in my research that I found in the false advertising was one company made their commercials sound like it was for women to use for birth control. It was called the Lysol disinfectant. Ring any bells? But in all actuality, it didn't prevent birth control. And in the commercials, they said they had these doctors who would completely back it up, these European doctors. But further investigation actually showed that these doctors didn't even exist. They weren't even real. So November 13th, 1921 is the second time Margaret Sanger was arrested under the Comstock Act. And this is actually the day she was originally supposed to give the speech, her speech on the morality of birth control at the American Birth Control League's first conference. But she was arrested outside of the conference at the closing, so she couldn't give it. So when she was released on bail on November 18th is when she gave her speech, which I found interesting because she actually referenced it a lot in her speech. So, speaking of her speech, in her speech, Margaret defines morality as, what I gathered from it, as responsibility. To be moral, you must be responsible. And immorality is actually defined as recklessness and irresponsibility, with morality benefiting the individual and the race as a whole. So based on those definitions, then you have to go to defining birth control. Birth control is defined as to prevent conception, and it's based on 4 principles: that a child is desired in a family, that a child is conceived in love, a child is born of sound health, and that women have rights to control their own bodies. So then I asked myself the question, is it moral to keep such vital information from women? These women, when they didn't know what they were doing, gave themselves these at-home abortions. We all know at least a little bit about those. And back in 1920, it's because they didn't know how to, what was safe, what they were doing to their bodies. So how is that in any way, shape, or form responsible, mature, or moral? Margaret Sanger actually answered my question with this quote: "If we cannot trust women with the knowledge of her own body, then I claim that 2,000 years of Christian teaching has proved a failure." So with that quote in mind, I moved to today. Margaret Sanger, in my opinion, was a very passionate speaker with something very influential to say that that in 1920 we were scared to say. In all honesty, I'm obviously not scared to say it now. So, but she propelled an issue that is still heavily debated today, almost 100 years later, literally 100 years later, actually. And at least in my English class, that's what my English teacher taught me was a good speaker, a good writer, is if their topics and their speeches are what we will still talk about today, long after they've left this earth. What Margaret Sanger started was just a wanting to get information out into the minds of women who need it, has developed into a whole aspect of our society that we use as women's rights to do as she pleases. That's what we base women's rights off of. The American Birth Control League morphed into Planned Parenthood, which does what Margaret Sanger wanted them to do all along: distribute information, birth control, and even abortions to women who need them safely. The difference between the Planned Parenthood of today and the past is that information on birth control is something supported and encouraged today that most women, by the time they hit 13, know at least a little bit about. She points out the immorality and oppression of women in the 1920s by society and men who refused to give up control of anything over to women. Women didn't have the choice to do anything. They had to go to their husbands and through everything like that. And then, just as MLK said about Marcus Garvey from The Handwriting is on the Wall and the oppression of the Negroes, I'm going to go ahead and say the same about Margaret Sanger. She was one of the first women to give women as a whole the dignity and choice to actually choose their own destinies. Thank you.